The deep hum of the ambulance engine echoed through the dense forest as Emma guided the vehicle along the winding road. The headlights cut through the mist that clung to the trees, illuminating the damp pavement ahead. It had rained earlier, leaving everything slick with moisture, the air thick with the earthy scent of wet pine and soil. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its lonely call swallowed by the vastness of the woods. The night felt particularly quiet, the kind of silence that made Emma's skin prickle with unease. Beside her, Jake was scrolling through the patient's file on the tablet, his eyes flickering over the details as he muttered to himself. 74 years old. History of hypertension, lives alone. The caller didn't specify, but it sounds like possible cardiac distress. He exhaled sharply. We need to get there fast. Emma nodded, adjusting her grip on the steering wheel. If these roads would cooperate. The path ahead was narrow, twisting sharply through the mountain pass, flanked by towering trees that cast long, skeletal shadows across the asphalt. It was the kind of road that made her uneasy on the best of days. One wrong move, and they'd end up in a ditch or worse. But tonight, something about it felt different. The night was still, unnervingly so. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of wildlife. Just the low purr of the ambulance cutting through the emptiness. And then, suddenly something moved. From the darkness beyond the reach of the headlights, a massive shape emerged, breaking onto the road with startling speed. Emma's breath hitched, her foot slammed against the brake, and the ambulance screeched to a halt. The seatbelt locked against her chest as she jolted forward, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Jake swore under his breath. There, illuminated in the stark white glow of the headlights, stood a black bear. It was enormous. Its thick, dark fur glistened with dampness, clumped together in places as though something had been smeared through it. Its massive paws pressed against the pavement, claws curling slightly as it adjusted its stance. Its breath came in deep, heaving pants, visible in the cold night air. But it wasn't just the bear's size that unsettled Emma. It was its posture. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't defensive. It was waiting. The bear stood still in the middle of the road, staring at them with dark, glassy eyes. Its ears twitched slightly, but it made no move to charge, no sound of warning. There was something almost human about the way it looked at them, something pleading. Jake let out a slow, shaky breath. Emma, what the hell is it doing? Emma didn't answer. She wasn't sure. Bears didn't behave like this. She had encountered them before, seen them dart across roads or rummage through trash on late-night calls, but they never lingered. They never just stood there, staring, unmoving. Her hands tightened around the wheel. Is it hurt? Jake leaned forward slightly, squinting through the windshield. I don't see any wounds. No blood. But something was wrong. The bear's body trembled slightly, its powerful frame shuddering with each labored breath. Its massive head tilted, its nostrils flaring as if trying to catch a scent. The way it moved, slow, deliberate, almost careful, sent a chill crawling up Emma's spine. Then it did something that made her blood run cold. It lowered its head, just slightly, and let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl, not a warning, a noise that was almost a whimper. Jake stiffened beside her. Did it just? Emma's pulse quickened. It sounds like it's asking for help. The words left her mouth before she could fully process them. But she knew, deep in her gut, that it was true. The bear wasn't trying to scare them. It wasn't blocking their path and aggression. It was standing there, waiting because it needed something. Because it needed them. The realization sent a ripple of unease through her. Jake shifted in his seat. This doesn't make sense. Bears don't. He stopped mid-sentence as the bear took a step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate. Its claws scraped lightly against the asphalt, its breath still coming in heavy, labored huffs. It wasn't charging. It wasn't threatening. It was just moving closer. Emma swallowed hard. Should we get out? Jake hesitated. That's a terrible idea. Emma knew he was right. They were paramedics, not wildlife experts. Getting out of the ambulance could be dangerous, even if the bear didn't seem aggressive. But something about the way it was standing there, staring at them, made it impossible to just drive away. It was desperate. The bear took another step, its massive shoulders rolling as it moved. Then something unexpected happened. It lowered itself onto its belly, pressing its massive frame against the cold pavement. Its breath shuddered as it exhaled, its muscles visibly trembling. And then, it stretched out one of its front paws toward them. Emma felt her stomach drop. "Oh my God," Jake whispered. "It really is asking for help." Emma's fingers hovered over the door handle. Every instinct told her to stay inside, to be cautious, to remember that this was a wild animal. But her training, the very thing that had driven her to become a paramedic in the first place, screamed at her to do something. She took a slow, steadying breath. "Jake, hand me the flashlight." He hesitated for a moment, then reached for the large LED flashlight from the compartment between their seats. She took it with a nod of thanks, then carefully clicked it on, angling the beam toward the bear's extended paw. Her breath caught. There, tangled around the bear's thick claws, was a mess of jagged metal wire. A snare. Emma's stomach twisted. "It's caught in something," Jake cursed. "Some kind of trap?" The bear let out another low, rumbling noise, a sound that was unmistakably pained. Emma exchanged a look with Jake. They had been trained to handle human emergencies, but this was something else entirely. Yet, as she stared at the bear, at the quiet desperation in its dark, pleading eyes, she knew they couldn't just leave it there. "Call for backup," she said quietly. Jake was already reaching for the radio. The bear remained still, waiting, as if it understood, as if it knew help was finally coming. The bear lingered at the edge of the road, half in shadow, half illuminated by the ambulance's headlights, its massive frame blending into the dense darkness of the forest behind it. Its breath came in slow, deliberate puffs of mist in the cold night air, nostrils flaring as it watched them. Emma could feel its gaze, heavy and deliberate, as if it were studying them, waiting for something. The silence stretched between them, thick and unnatural, broken only by the faint crackling of the radio inside the ambulance. A voice from dispatch crackled through the static, asking for confirmation, but neither she nor Jake moved to respond. It felt irrelevant, distant, as if the moment unfolding before them had cut them off from the rest of the world. The bear shifted its weight, muscles rolling beneath its thick fur, then took a slow step back, its massive paws pressing into the wet pavement. It didn't move with the skittish, unpredictable energy of a wild animal. Instead, its movements were measured, deliberate, almost cautious. It tilted its head slightly, ears flicking, and then, in a motion so precise it sent a chill creeping up Emma's spine, it turned its head toward the dark expanse of trees before looking back at them. It took another step, then another, not fleeing, not running, but waiting, beckoning. Jake inhaled sharply beside her, his voice barely more than a breath. "It's leading us?" Emma didn't answer, because she already knew. She could feel it deep in her gut, that overwhelming certainty that this wasn't just a wild animal retreating into the woods. It wasn't afraid. It wasn't warning them away. It was asking them to come. A pulse of unease thrummed through her as she tightened her grip on the flashlight. Every rational part of her screamed that this was absurd, that it was reckless to follow, but she couldn't shake the feeling that if they let this moment pass, if they turned back now, they would regret it. The bear took another step into the shadows, then stopped, looking over its shoulder once more. The gesture was unmistakable. Jake exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his nerves fraying at the edges. "Emma, you know how insane this is, right?" His voice was low, urgent, edged with disbelief. "We're paramedics. We don't follow bears into the woods. We don't." He gestured toward the towering trees, toward the waiting darkness. "We don't do this." Emma swallowed, her throat dry. "I know. Then why are we even considering it?" The words were logical, grounded, the kind of reasoning she knew she should be listening to. But logic didn't fit here. Logic had no place in this strange, heavy moment, in the eerie stillness of the forest pressing in around them, in the silent conversation unfolding between them and the waiting bear. Emma turned to face Jake fully, meeting his wary gaze. "Because this isn't normal," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty curling inside her. "Because it's not just leaving. It's waiting. It's asking." She hesitated, trying to put into words the deep, instinctive certainty building inside her. "If we don't follow it, if we ignore this, and something is out there, something we could have helped, can you live with that?" Jake let out a sharp, frustrated breath, glancing between her and the bear, which still stood just beyond the reach of the headlights, its hulking form blending into the shifting shadows of the trees. It exhaled again, its breath curling into the cold air, and then, almost impossibly, it nodded. Emma's stomach flipped. She hadn't imagined it. She hadn't misread its movements. The bear had nodded. Jake saw it too. His mouth parted slightly, eyes flickering with something torn between disbelief and fear. "Emma?" She didn't wait for him to finish. Her decision was already made. Without another word, she stepped forward. The damp earth beneath her boots gave slightly under her weight as she crossed the threshold from the paved road into the wild undergrowth, the thick scent of pine and wet soil wrapping around her. The moment she moved, the bear exhaled again, almost like relief, then turned and began walking deeper into the woods. It didn't charge ahead, didn't disappear into the darkness. It moved slowly, deliberately, its steps careful, as if making sure they could follow. Emma felt Jake hesitate behind her, his presence a weight on the edge of her awareness, his indecision palpable. Then, after a few long seconds, he muttered something under his breath and fell in a step beside her. "This is the dumbest thing we've ever done," he grumbled. Emma almost smiled. Probably, but she didn't stop walking. The deeper they moved into the forest, the more the world behind them faded. The ambulance, the road, the glow of civilization, all of it was swallowed by the towering trees, the heavy night closing in around them. The forest was thick, the air damp and cool, the distant drip of water from the leaves the only sound aside from their own breath. The bear walked ahead of them, silent, its massive frame moving with a strange sort of grace despite its size. Emma glanced at Jake, catching the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers twitched at his sides. "You okay?" He let out a breath through his nose. "No. You." "No." They walked anyway. The trees grew denser, the air heavier, the night stretching endlessly before them. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the unknown pressing against her ribs. And yet, despite the fear, despite the cold thread of uncertainty weaving through her, she kept following. Because the bear was still leading them forward. Because it had asked them to. And because, somehow, impossibly, she knew they were meant to go. The forest swallowed them whole. Thick trunks rose like silent sentinels around them, their branches stretching high above, blotting out the sky. The deeper they followed the bear, the more the darkness seemed to close in, muting the world behind them. The ambulance, the road, the distant crackling of the radio. Everything felt impossibly far away now, as though they had stepped into another world entirely, one where only the trees, the damp earth beneath their boots, and the slow, deliberate movement of the bear ahead of them existed. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked soil, pine, and something else. Something faint, something sour. Emma wrinkled her nose, her senses prickling. It was wrong. The natural smells of the forest, the damp bark, the decomposing leaves, the fresh coolness of night, had been tainted by something sickly, something that sent a pulse of unease through her veins. She exchanged a glance with Jake, who was walking just behind her, his flashlight beam bouncing off the uneven ground. His face was tight, his shoulders hunched with tension. The bear kept moving, its steps slow but purposeful, never too far ahead, always turning back to make sure they were still following. The deeper they went, the stronger that awful scent became. Emma swallowed against the nausea curling in her stomach. There was something out here, something they weren't meant to find. Then the bear stopped. It stood at the edge of a small clearing, its breath coming in thick, heavy puffs. Its dark eyes flickered toward them before it lowered its head, nudging something on the ground. Emma stepped closer, her heartbeat hammering in her ears, and then she saw them. Her breath caught. There, Half hidden in the tall grass were three small, unmoving shapes. Bear cubs. A sound pressed against her throat, something between a gasp and a sob, but it never made it past her lips. She felt Jake go rigid beside her, the light from his flashlight trembling slightly as it illuminated the small bodies. The first cub, lying closest to them, was completely still, its tiny frame unnaturally stiff, its fur damp and matted. The second, curled just beyond it, was in the same state. Motionless, lifeless, its body twisted slightly as though it had fallen mid-step. The third, Emma's heart clenched. The third cub was still breathing. Barely. Its small chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular movements, its mouth slightly open, a thin strand of saliva clinging to its jaw. Its fur was soaked with something dark, something thick and clotted. It let out a weak, shuddering whimper, so faint that if Emma hadn't been standing right there, she wouldn't have heard it. "Oh, God," Jake murmured, his voice tight with something raw, something close to horror. What the hell happened? Emma was already moving, her body operating on pure instinct. She dropped to her knees beside the struggling cub, her hands hovering over its fragile frame, terrified of making it worse. Up close, she could see the signs, wounds along its tiny legs, patches of missing fur, deep scratches that looked too uniform to be from a fight. And the smell, the sickly, acrid scent that had been clinging to the air, was coming from the cub itself. Poison. The realization hit her like a physical blow, making her stomach lurch. Jake must have seen it at the same time, because he sucked in a sharp breath. "Emma," he said, his voice strained. "This isn't just an injury. This was done on purpose." Emma's hands clenched into fists. Someone had done this. Someone had set traps, had left poison, had ensured that whatever found it would suffer. The two dead cubs, the barely surviving third, the desperate, pleading mother that had led them here. It all painted a horrifying picture. She forced herself to focus. They could be horrified later. Right now, they had to do something. "The wounds are bad," she said, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. "But the poisoning is worse. If we don't get help, it won't last long." Jake ran a hand down his face, looking around the dark clearing as if expecting some kind of answer to appear. "Animal control's too far. We're the only ones here." He let out a breath. "What do we do?" Emma swallowed. They weren't veterinarians. They weren't equipped for this. But they were trained to save lives, and right now, this cub needed them more than anything. "We bring it back to the ambulance," she said firmly. "We do whatever we can." Jake didn't argue. He just nodded. Emma turned back to the mother bear, her heart aching at the way the massive creature stood over her dying cub, her dark eyes locked onto Emma's every movement. She wasn't growling, wasn't reacting aggressively, just watching, hoping. Emma met her gaze and nodded. "We'll save it," she promised. And for the first time, she swore she saw something shift in the bear's eyes. Something like trust. The clearing was silent except for the shallow, labored breaths of the last surviving cub. The cold night air pressed against Emma's skin as she knelt beside the tiny, trembling body, her heartbeat pounding like a war drum against her ribs. The mother bear stood just feet away, unmoving, watching. The sheer size of her was staggering in the darkness, her shadow stretching across the forest floor, but there was no aggression in her stance, no sign of a threat. She did not growl or bristle at their presence. She simply stood there, her dark eyes locked on Emma's hands, as if silently willing her to act. Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe as she reached into the first aid kit Jake had laid open beside her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out gauze, antiseptic, and a pair of scissors to cut away the matted fur around the cub's wounds. The deep scratches, the patches of missing hair, the way the little body twitched weakly beneath her hands. Every part of it screamed of suffering. But it was the smell that filled her with a sick, burning rage. The acrid stench of poison clung to the cub's fur, mixed with the scent of blood and damp earth. This wasn't just an accident. This was deliberate. Someone had done this. Jake hovered nearby, his flashlight beamed steady, but his expression grim. He was keeping a wary eye on the mother bear, But Emma could see it in his face. He understood just as she did. If this bear had wanted to attack them, she would have done it already. Instead, she stood there, silent, trusting. Jake exhaled, his voice low and rough. "Emma, you sure about this?" She nodded once, barely looking up. "I need to clean the wounds first. Then we focus on the poisoning." Jake muttered something under his breath, but dropped to his knees beside her, already reaching for the medical bag. They had treated wounds like this before, lacerations, infections, even deep tissue injuries, but never on a wild animal. And never with the mother standing so close, watching every move. Emma took a slow breath, then carefully pressed the gauze against the worst of the gashes. The cub let out a weak, pitiful sound, a faint whimper that barely had the strength to escape its tiny body. The mother bear let out a low, breathy huff in response, her weight shifting slightly. Emma froze, her hand stilling against the cub's fragile frame. The bear didn't move closer. She didn't bare her teeth or lunge forward. She just watched. Emma felt her throat tighten. This was a mother's grief, a mother's desperation. Jake's voice was quiet, but firm. "Keep going. She's letting us help." Emma pressed down gently, staunching the slow but steady trickle of blood. She worked quickly but carefully, dabbing antiseptic over the cuts, trimming away the tangled mess of fur around them, doing everything she could to minimize the damage. Every so often, she glanced up at the mother bear, half expecting her patience to snap, half expecting this fragile truce to break apart. But the bear never moved. Minutes passed, stretching endlessly between them, each one feeling heavier than the last. The cub remained motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of its tiny chest. "The poison," Jake muttered. "That's what's killing it." Emma knew. She could see it in the unnatural tremors racking the cub's body, in the way its muscles spasmed involuntarily. The wounds were bad, but the poison was worse. It was working its way deeper, shutting down the little body before their eyes. She reached for the small syringe she always carried in her kit. It was a basic solution, activated charcoal, something they used for human poisoning cases to absorb toxins before they spread further. Would it work the same way in a bear cub? She had no idea, but it was the only thing she had. Jake hesitated when he saw her pull it out. "You think it'll help?" Emma looked down at the cub. "It's all we have." She drew the liquid into the syringe, her pulse hammering in her ears. The mother bear let out another slow, heavy breath. Emma didn't look up. She couldn't. If she hesitated now, if she let fear slow her hands, the cub wouldn't make it. Carefully, she tilted the cub's tiny head and slid the tip of the syringe past its lips, squeezing small, careful doses into its mouth, letting the thick black liquid coat its tongue. The cub twitched but didn't resist. Emma worked quickly, administering as much as she dared without overwhelming its fragile system. And then, they waited. The forest stretched around them, the wind whispering through the branches, the scent of damp leaves and earth thick in the air. The only sound was the shallow rasp of the cub's breathing and the quiet, rhythmic huffs of the mother bear. Emma felt every second crawl by, each one heavier than the last, pressing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. Jake exhaled beside her, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know if it's working." Emma didn't answer. She didn't know either. She watched the cub's tiny, fragile body, watched for any sign, any change, no matter how small. It was still breathing. That was all she could focus on. As long as it was breathing, there was hope. The mother bear let out a deep, rumbling exhale, shifting her weight. Emma looked up, her stomach twisting with uncertainty. The bear's dark eyes met hers, filled with something raw, something desperate. Emma didn't need words to understand. This bear had already lost 2 of her cubs. She had carried their lifeless bodies here, had sought out the only help she could find. And now, standing over the only child she had left, she was watching these strange, unfamiliar creatures, humans, the same kind responsible for the suffering in the first place, trying to save it. And she was trusting them. Emma swallowed past the tightness in her throat, nodding slightly. "We're doing everything we can," she whispered, more to herself than anything. The bear didn't respond. She just stood there, her great heaving breaths the only sound in the clearing. Minutes passed, the tension thick and suffocating. The cub's breathing remained shallow, but the tremors had started to slow. Emma dared to hope. Jake let out a low breath. "It's not getting worse." Emma nodded. "That's something." She reached down, gently pressing her fingers against the cub's tiny ribcage, feeling the faint but steady rise and fall of its chest. It was still weak, so weak, but it was there. It was fighting. She turned her gaze back to the mother bear, her heart pounding against her ribs. "It's going to make it," she said softly. And for the first time, she swore she saw it. The slightest shift in the bear's expression, a flicker of something deep in her dark, weary eyes. Relief. The clearing remained deathly silent, except for the shallow, ragged breaths of the tiny bear cub struggling for life. The darkness pressed in around them, thick and suffocating, broken only by the harsh beams of their flashlights cutting through the night. The cold earth beneath Emma's knees seeped through the fabric of her uniform, but she barely noticed. Every ounce of her focus was locked onto the fragile body in front of her, onto the barely perceptible rise and fall of its tiny chest. Beside her, Jake kept his flashlight steady, his free hand gripping the radio clipped to his vest. His voice was tense, clipped, barely masking the strain beneath it. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. We have a critical situation in the forest. Injured and poisoned bear cub. Request immediate veterinary assistance. Repeat, immediate veterinary assistance." Static crackled through the radio, followed by the faint, delayed response. "Unit 4, Animal Control, is dispatching a team, but ETA is at least 40 minutes. Hold tight and keep us updated." Jake exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. 40 minutes? His voice was low, disbelieving. "Emma, I don't know if it has 40 minutes. Emma knew. The poison was still coursing through the cub's system, and though the activated charcoal had slowed it down, it wasn't enough. The wounds were bad, but the real battle was happening inside, where she had no way of seeing the damage. Every breath the cub took sounded thin and wet, and every tiny twitch of its limbs sent a sharp pulse of dread through her chest. She looked at Jake, her voice steadier than she felt. "Then we don't stop." Jake gave her a tight nod, already reaching for supplies. Emma grabbed a small oxygen mask from their kit, the kind designed for infants, and carefully slipped it over the cub's tiny muzzle. It wasn't a perfect fit, but it was the best they had. She adjusted the flow, praying that the extra oxygen would ease the strain on its struggling lungs. The cub whimpered weakly at the contact, barely reacting beyond a slight shudder. Emma's throat tightened. She could feel the mother bear's presence just behind her, watching every move. The massive creature remained completely still, her dark eyes locked on her last surviving cub, her deep, steady breaths the only sign that she was alive. She hadn't moved from her spot, hadn't tried to intervene. She had placed all of her hope in these strange creatures, these humans who had every reason to be her enemy, and yet she let them work. Emma forced herself to stay calm, to move with purpose, not panic. She glanced up at Jake, who was preparing a second dose of activated charcoal. He hesitated for a split second, then muttered, "Screw it," before carefully administering another small amount into the cub's mouth. They had no guarantee it would help, no way of knowing if they were doing this right, but doing nothing was not an option. The cub's tiny, fragile body jerked slightly, its muscles spasming in response. Emma immediately placed a steadying hand on its side, feeling the uneven rhythm of its breathing. Each breath labored, slow, but still there. She glanced at her watch. 5 minutes had passed since they started. It felt like a lifetime. Jake wiped a hand across his forehead, his expression tight. "If it was a person, I'd be starting in 4 right now," he muttered. "But I doubt this little guy has veins big enough for that." Emma let out a breath through her nose. "We don't need in 4. We just need to keep it alive." Another minute passed. Then another. The cub's breathing remained unsteady, but the spasms had lessened. It wasn't getting worse. That was something. Emma dared to glance up at the mother bear. She was still standing in the same spot, her gaze unwavering. But there was something different in her posture now. A slight shift, a subtle lowering of her massive head, as if she sensed the change. As if, somehow, she knew her baby was still holding on. A sound broke the silence. The distant wail of sirens. Emma's entire body tensed at the sound, her pulse leaping in her throat. Jake heard it too. His head snapped toward the direction of the road. Reinforcements. Emma let out a shaky breath. Relief crashing through her in a wave, so strong it nearly made her dizzy. They weren't alone anymore. The sound grew louder, closer, and then light. A second set of headlights appeared through the trees, cutting through the darkness. Flashlights bobbed in the distance, voices calling out. Emma turned toward Jake, her heart hammering. "Let's get them over here." Jake was already moving. He rose to his feet, waving his flashlight high in the air, signaling their location. "Over here! We got the cub!" Figures emerged from the trees, moving quickly, purposefully. A team of animal control officers and veterinarians, their jackets marked with emergency emblems, their hands filled with equipment Emma didn't recognize but welcomed with every fiber of her being. One of them, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a steady presence, immediately dropped to her knees beside Emma, her gloved hands already moving to assess the cub. "Talk to me. What are we dealing with?" Emma exhaled sharply, her voice quick, efficient. "Poisoning. We administered activated charcoal, oxygen support, tried to stabilize its vitals. Breathing is shallow but steady." The vet nodded, her movements swift but careful. She checked the cub's eyes, its reflexes, then glanced up at the mother bear, her expression unreadable. "And she let you help?" Emma barely had the energy to process the weight of the question. "She brought us here," she said simply. The vet didn't respond, but Emma saw the way her mouth tightened slightly, as if she, too, understood the impossible significance of that fact. The rest of the team moved quickly, setting up medical equipment, working with practiced precision. Emma and Jake stepped back, giving them space, watching as they worked. The weight in Emma's chest didn't lift, not yet. Not until she saw one of the veterinarians carefully wrap the cub in a warm blanket, lifting its fragile body into a specialized transport carrier. "Will it make it?" Jake asked, his voice tight. The lead vet hesitated, then met his gaze. "It's still critical, but it has a chance." Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A chance. She turned back toward the mother bear. The massive creature still hadn't moved. But as the team lifted her cub, as they carefully began the process of carrying it toward their waiting vehicle, something shifted in her dark eyes. She knew. Emma couldn't explain how, but she knew that the bear understood. The mother bear let out a long, slow breath, her great shoulders rising and falling with emotion. Then, finally, she stepped forward, closing the small distance between them. Emma didn't move, didn't breathe. The bear lowered her head slightly, exhaling once more, so close now that Emma could feel the warmth of her breath against her skin. And then, she turned. Slowly, without a sound, the bear walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the trees. Jake exhaled sharply. Holy shit! Emma could only nod, watching the place where the bear had stood. She had trusted them. And now, she was gone. The world did not return to normal after that night. For days, the scent of damp earth and pine still clung to Emma's clothes, even after she had showered. The weight of the mother bear's gaze still pressed against her chest, an invisible force she could not shake, could not forget. The rhythmic rise and fall of the cub's fragile breath haunted her, playing over and over in her mind as if she were still kneeling in that cold, dark clearing, waiting, praying for a miracle. The forest had been silent that night, but the silence that followed in the days after was even heavier. The events that unfolded beneath the towering trees, in the depths of the wilderness where no one was supposed to be watching, had somehow spilled into the world beyond. Emma and Jake had witnessed something rare, something raw and undeniable, a moment where the boundaries between human and animal had blurred, where instinct and reason had tangled into something impossible to explain. And now there were questions. The authorities arrived the next morning, too late to see the trust in the mother bear's eyes, too late to feel the desperate weight of the night pressing down on their lungs. They had only facts to work with, 3 bear cubs poisoned, 2 dead, 1 barely saved. The remains of a trap, crude and rusted, hidden beneath the undergrowth. The undeniable evidence of human interference. The investigation that followed was swift, but in Emma's mind, it was almost meaningless. No amount of arrests or fines could erase what had been done. The cubs were still gone. The mother bear would never forget. She and Jake gave their statements, detailing every moment, every breath, every choice that had led them deeper into the woods that night. Some looked at them like they were reckless, like they had lost their minds following a wild animal into the unknown. Others listened in silence, their expressions unreadable, as if trying to understand something they had never considered before. But no one could deny the truth. The bear had come to them. She had sought them out, had trusted them, had placed the life of her last cub in their hands. And in doing so, she had shattered something fragile and artificial, the illusion that humans and animals were meant to exist in separate worlds, that nature was something to be controlled, not understood. News spread quickly. It started as whispers. Hushed conversations passed between co-workers, between officials, between those who had never thought twice about the creatures that lived just beyond their own backyards. Then the headlines followed, bold and disbelieving. Paramedics save dying bear cub after mother leads them to poisoning scene. Tragedy in the forest. Illegal traps kill 2 cubs, third rescued by EMTs. The story took on a life of its own, spreading further than Emma ever expected. And with it came change. For the first time in years, there were real conversations about the dangers of human interference in the wild, about the unseen victims, the creatures that suffered in silence, out of sight where no one thought to look. The incident forced a new urgency into the discussion. Wildlife protection groups took up the cause, pushing for stricter laws against poaching, against poisoning, against the careless destruction of habitats. Fines were raised. Patrols increased. People who had once ignored the issue began to care, began to listen. The forest, for the first time in a long time, had a voice. Emma found herself at the center of it, though she had never wanted to be. She and Jake were asked to speak at meetings, to recount what had happened, to describe the moment when a mother bear had placed her last hope in the hands of the very species that had stolen everything else from her. Jake hated it. "I didn't sign up for this," he grumbled one evening, slumping into a chair in the break room after yet another phone call from a journalist. "I'm a paramedic, not a wildlife activist." Emma smiled, though it was tired. "Neither am I." And yet, here they were. Because it wasn't just about the bear anymore. It wasn't just about that one night, that one mother, that one cub. It was about all the times before, all the times after. It was about the way humans had built roads through forests and expected animals to stay out of the way, the way they dumped their waste into rivers and were shocked when the fish began to die, the way they left poison and metal teeth hidden beneath the undergrowth and didn't think twice about what might find them. But the mother bear had thought twice. She had gone against every instinct, every warning buried in her blood, and had chosen trust instead of fear. And that was something Emma could not forget. One afternoon, weeks after it had all begun, she found herself driving back to the edge of the forest. There was no reason for it, no logical excuse. She just needed to see, needed to remind herself that the world still existed beyond the fluorescent lights of the hospital, beyond the endless phone calls and meetings and questions. She parked at the same spot where the ambulance had once stood, staring down the empty road, listening to the wind move through the trees. The forest was quiet, peaceful, as if none of it had ever happened, as if the world had simply continued on, unbothered by the tragedy that had played out beneath its branches. Emma closed her eyes and exhaled. Then, from somewhere deep within the trees, a slow, familiar sound rumbled through the air. A breath, a presence. She opened her eyes, and there, standing just at the tree line, barely visible in the fading light, was the mother bear. She did not move closer. She did not make a sound. She only stood there, watching. Emma felt her chest tighten, something unspoken settling into the space between them. The mother bear had lost so much, but she had also saved something, and so had Emma. She gave the faintest nod, a silent acknowledgement, a quiet understanding. And then, As quickly as she had appeared, the bear turned and disappeared back into the trees.